Have you ever found yourself, at like 2 in the morning, completely paralyzed in a Wikipedia rabbit hole?
Oh, absolutely. Just completely lost in the links.
Right. Like you're reading about the exact shape of a woodpecker's tongue and you're sitting there wondering why on earth you actually need to know this information.
Right, like, how did I even get here?
Exactly. Well, today we are validating that exact impulse because history's ultimate genius didn't get there by staying perfectly focused on his career goals.
No, not at all.
He got there by being spectacularly, just unapologetically distracted.
It's so true. I mean, we often trap historical figures in these very clean, uh, retroactive narratives.
Oh, totally. Like they had it all figured out from day one.
Exactly. We look at a famous painting in the Louvre, and we just assume the person who created it possessed some sort of, like, divine processing power.
A lightning strike of genius that we mere mortals just can't possibly fathom.
Right. But if you actually dig into the raw material of Leonardo da Vinci's life, that whole illusion just shatters.
It really does.
His genius was, it was profoundly human. It was hammered out through sheer will, a relentless, almost childlike curiosity.
Yeah, an imagination that just frequently blurred the line between empirical observation and, pure fantasy.
Right.
So the roadmap for our deep dive today is Walter Isaacson's phenomenal biography of Leonardo.
Such a great book.
It really is. And our mission today is not to just walk through some, chronological list of his greatest hits.
No, that would be boring.
Uh,
We are going to reverse engineer his mind.
exactly. We want to figure out the actual mechanics of how a kid from the Tuscan Hills became the literal archetype of the Renaissance man.
And, the best entry point into that incredibly messy, very human mind isn't his polished masterpieces.
No, it's paper.
Right, paper. Specifically, the more than 7,200 pages of his surviving notebooks.
Which is just an unfathomable amount of writing.
It's arguably the greatest continuous record of human curiosity ever assembled. I mean, paper was incredibly expensive in the 15th century.
Oh, yeah, you didn't just doodle on it and throw it away.
Exactly. So he didn't waste a millimeter. He would cram every single inch of the page with overlapping thoughts.
It's literally a dizzying cross-disciplinary storm.
Yeah. You will find incredibly complex geometric calculations scribbled directly over, like a botanical sketch of a flower.
Right, which is right next to a mechanical diagram of a blood valve.
And then that borders a caricature of an old man with this grotesque, exaggerated nose.
It's the physical manifestation of having, 36 browser tabs open simultaneously.
That is the perfect analogy, yes.
But instead of the system crashing, he's somehow finding the hidden underlying source code connecting every single tab.
Right.
And I just have to share some of the specific to-do lists he wrote for himself in these notebooks because they capture this vibe perfectly.
Oh, they are the best.
Just listen to the sheer randomness of what he demanded of his own brain. He writes, and I'm quoting here, "Observe the goose's foot. If it were always open or always closed, the creature would not be able to make any kind of movement."
Just a casual observation for the day.
Right. Then, on another day, he writes, "Get the master of arithmetic to show you how to square a triangle."
And then, of course, the legendary entry.
Yes. Describe the tongue of the woodpecker.
I mean, think about the underlying motivation behind that last item. He wasn't planning a painting of a woodpecker.
Right, it's not like a commission.
Exactly. He wasn't trying to engineer a machine based on a bird's beak. There was zero practical application here.
No patron was demanding a report on avian tongues.
Right. He simply realized that a woodpecker slams its face into a tree at immense speed without destroying its brain. And he needed to know the physical mechanism allowing that to happen.
He just wanted to marvel at the sheer complex mechanics of the world.
Exactly. And to understand a mind that operates like that, we really have to travel back to the very beginning.
Right, because a series of apparent disadvantages in his youth actually formed the perfect incubator for this highly unique worldview.
Yeah, we are moving away from that myth of the divine touched by God genius, and we're looking at the very humble, distinctly unconventional reality of his birth.
He was born in 1452 in Vinci, which is just a small hill town in Tuscany.
Yeah. And his name, Leonardo da Vinci, literally just translates to Leonardo from Vinci.
Right, because he didn't have a formal surname?
Yes, exactly. Because of the circumstances of his birth. His mother, Caterina, was a 16-year-old orphan peasant girl, completely impoverished.
And his father was sort of the opposite, right?
Very much so. His father, Sir Piero, was a 24-year-old rising star in the local professional class. Sir Piero was a prosperous notary.
Part of a whole family line of notaries. I think the book said it stretched back 5 generations.
Right. But because Sir Piero was already betrothed to someone else, a 16-year-old girl from a prominent shoemaking family marrying Caterina was totally off the table.
So Leonardo was born out of wedlock.
Yes,
So his illegitimacy is essentially the foundational fact of his entire life.
it really is.
But, in reading the sources for this deep dive, this isn't framed as some tragic Dickensian origin story.
No, not at all.
It's actually framed as his greatest stroke of luck.
Yeah, because Renaissance Italy was uniquely tolerant in this regard. Historians have famously dubbed it a golden age for bastards.
Which is quite the title.
It is. But being a love child wasn't a cause for total social excommunication back then. I mean, you had ruling dukes and even popes who openly acknowledged illegitimate children.
Wow, even popes.
Oh, yeah, they passed power down to them and everything. However, for the middle class, the professional class like his father, there were very specific, highly bureaucratic roadblocks.
Oh, right. The guilds.
Exactly. The Venerable Guild of Judges and Notaries. This was the institution that gave Sir Piero his livelihood and his social standing.
And they had rules about this sort of thing.
Very strict rules. The guild had incredibly strict moral and legal codes, and one of their foundational rules barred anyone born out of wedlock from joining. Period.
No exceptions.
No workaround at all.
So his illegitimacy acts as a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card for the family business.
Exactly.
Because if he had been legitimate, the crushing weight of 5 generations of expectation would have just forced him to sit at a desk in Florence.
Right. Spending his entire adult life drawing up commercial contracts, land deeds, and dowry agreements in Latin.
Which sounds like a nightmare for someone like him.
It would have destroyed him. He was entirely spared from that fate. And the ripple effects of being barred from the guild went much deeper.
How so?
Well, it struck at the very core of how he was educated. If you were destined for the professional class of the 1400s, you were sent to a Latin school.
Okay, what were those like?
These were institutions dedicated to the classics, the humanities, medieval dogma, and ancient texts. Education was essentially just rote memorization of accepted authority.
So you read what Aristotle or Thomas Aquinas said and you just accepted it as absolute truth.
Exactly. But because Leonardo couldn't join the guild, his father didn't waste money sending him to a Latin school.
Instead, he goes to an abacus school, which honestly sounds kind of like a demotion, right?
It does sound like one, but from an intellectual standpoint, it's completely different wiring for the brain.
Because it's a different curriculum.
Right. The abacus schools were for merchants. They taught practical, commercial math, geometry, and how to calculate exchange rates. It was entirely applied knowledge.
So he missed out on the classical brainwashing entirely.
Yes. Now, it is important to note that later in life, when he was surrounded by these highly polished Renaissance intellectuals and philosophers in courts across Italy, he did feel a lingering insecurity about his background.
Oh, for sure. He would lash out in his notebooks, right?
Yeah, he would sarcastically refer to himself as an unlettered man. He actively mocked the pompous fools who walked around quoting ancient poetry but couldn't understand the physical world right in front of them.
He weaponized his lack of formal schooling.
You really did.
He actually coined a title for himself, signing his pages Leonardo da Vinci, Discepolo dell'Esperienza, meaning disciple of experience.
Which is brilliant. He's essentially laying the groundwork for the scientific method right there.
Exactly. He's basically saying, look, I don't care what a 1,000-year-old book says about how water flows. I'm going to drop a piece of wood in a river and watch the eddy currents myself.
Because he hadn't been taught what to think by those Latin schools, he was forced to develop his own rigorous system for how to observe.
His empirical approach to nature was born directly out of his outsider status.
Completely. And his early observations, even as a toddler, are incredibly intense.
Yeah, there are 2 very specific childhood memories recorded in his notebooks that serve as like these incredible windows into his developing psychology.
Right, starting with the famous memory of the kite.
A kite being, in this context, a type of bird of prey with a very distinctive forked tail common in the Tuscan hills.
Right. So Leonardo recalled this moment from his infancy, lying in his cradle, when a kite flew down from the sky, opened his mouth with its tail, and struck his lips repeatedly.
Okay, I have to pause here because this specific memory triggered one of the most famously botched psychological analyses in history.
Oh, it's so funny.
Decades later, Sigmund Freud gets a hold of a German translation of Leonardo's notebooks.
And the translator made a catastrophic error.
They translated the Italian word for kite as vulture.
Yes. And Freud just takes this mistranslation and runs wild with it.
He writes an entire psychoanalytic treatise connecting the vulture to ancient Egyptian mythology, Mother Nature, and ultimately concludes the memory is a repressed, passive homosexual fantasy involving fellatio.
It's wild. Freud builds an entire psychological house of cards on a typo.
Totally, completely missing the actual significance of the memory.
Exactly. The bird wasn't some mythological symbol of a mother figure. It was a physical machine that fascinated a boy who was obsessed with the mechanics of flight.
Because Leonardo was analyzing the tail of the kite, right?
Right, because he would later spend years studying how birds use their tail feathers to steer and brake. The memory is this fusion of a hazy childhood dream state and an acute, hyper-focused scientific observation.
That's so fascinating. And then the second childhood memory is even more cinematic.
Oh, the cave.
Yes, he's hiking in the dark, rocky hills outside Vinci, and he comes across the mouth of a massive, dark cave.
And he writes about standing at the edge and being hit by two completely contrary emotions simultaneously.
A deep fear of the threatening, pitch-black darkness and a burning desire to see if there was some marvelous thing hidden inside.
Fear and desire. It's the ultimate crucible for an explorer. And of course, the desire to know overpower the terror of the unknown.
So he steps into the dark, and what he finds is astonishing. He discovers a massive fossilized whale embedded in the rock of the cave walls.
Which is mind-blowing.
Imagine being a child in the 1400s, hundreds of miles from the sea, high up in the mountains, and finding the bones of a leviathan in the stone.
It permanently altered his perception of time and the earth.
It triggered a lifelong obsession with geology, didn't it?
Geology, fluid dynamics, everything. He realized that the landscape wasn't static, that water possessed the sheer, terrifying power to reshape the earth over millennia.
Because the mountain he was standing on was obviously once the bottom of an ocean.
Right. And this discovery gave him these intense, almost apocalyptic forebodings about grand deluges, flooding, and the cyclical destruction of nature.
Which are themes he would return to in his final drawings at the very end of his life.
Exactly. So we have the raw ingredients here. An illegitimate outsider, completely unburdened by medieval dogma, trained in practical math, and relentlessly driven to observe the physical mechanics of the world.
And then the setting changes. Around the time he turns 12, his grandfather dies, his father's young wife dies, and Ser Piero decides to bring Leonardo to live with him in the city.
Right, they moved to Florence.
Which is huge.
Oh, stepping into Florence in the 1460s was like stepping into the future. It is the absolute crucible of the Renaissance.
The sources describe it as this bustling, chaotic metropolis of 40,000 people. It boasted the highest literacy rate in all of Europe.
But what's crucial to understand is that Florence wasn't just a picturesque city of, painters and poets.
Right. It was an absolute financial juggernaut.
The florin, the gold coin minted in Florence, was the standard currency across Europe. It was literally the dollar of the 15th century.
And the city was a powerhouse of textile manufacturing, silk trading, and most importantly, banking.
Yes, and their banking dominance was driven by a very specific technological innovation.
Double-entry bookkeeping.
Exactly, which feels like a minor accounting detail.
Well, yeah, totally.
But it fundamentally restructured how people thought about the world. You have a ledger with credits on one side and debits on the other, and they must perfectly balance.
Right.
This mathematical harmony, this balancing of opposing forces, it seeped into the cultural consciousness. It is, to use a modern analogy, the original Silicon Valley.
I love that comparison. And the Silicon Valley analogy holds up under scrutiny because disciplines were not siloed in Florence.
Not at all.
In a traditional medieval society, the blacksmiths are over here, the painters are in another district, the bankers are locked away.
Right. But in Florence, the streets were narrow and the workshops were open air. You had lens crafters grinding optics next door to wood carvers.
Who were sharing space with silk weavers who are arguing with goldsmiths and merchants.
It was a chaotic, interdisciplinary mashup. And hovering above all of this innovation is the Medici family.
Specifically, Lorenzo the Magnificent.
Right. The Medici weren't just rulers. They functioned as the venture capitalists of the era.
They possessed immense wealth, and they weaponized it to fund public spectacles, groundbreaking architecture, and revolutionary art.
They were injecting massive amounts of capital into the local economy to fuel innovation and cement their own political legacy.
And that culture aggressively rewarded people who could cross-pollinate ideas. The ecosystem favored the polymath.
Exactly. And by the time young Leonardo arrives, the city had already been shaped by giants who broke down the barriers between art and engineering.
Right. There are two figures in particular who really paved the way for his specific brand of genius,
The first was Filippo Brunelleschi.
who coincidentally was also the son of a notary.
Yes, but Brunelleschi refused to follow his father's profession. He trained as a goldsmith, but he became obsessed with Roman ruins.
Right. He traveled to Rome, measured the ancient structures, and brought that engineering knowledge back to Florence.
Because he wanted to solve an impossible problem, building the massive self-supporting dome of the Florence Cathedral.
Which was an unparalleled feat of heavy engineering. It required him to invent entirely new types of cranes and hoists.
But Brunelleschi's true revolutionary contribution was the discovery, or I guess rediscovery, of linear perspective.
Okay, this is one of those concepts we take for granted today, but I want to break down exactly how he proved it because the mechanics of his experiment are just fascinating.
Oh, it was brilliant.
He didn't just write a theory about perspective, he built a physical optical device.
Right. He takes a wooden panel and paints a highly detailed image of the Florence Baptistry on it, calculating all the converging lines to a single vanishing point.
And then he does something so weird. He drills a small hole straight through the vanishing point on the painted panel.
Yes. The execution of the experiment is amazing. You take the painted panel and stand in the exact spot where Brunelleschi stood to paint it, facing the real baptistry.
Right.
You hold the panel up to your face with the unpainted back toward you, and you look through the drilled hole. In your other hand, you hold a mirror directly in front of the painted side.
So as you look through the hole, you are seeing the reflection of the painting in the mirror.
Exactly. And when you drop the mirror, you see the actual physical baptistry.
Wow.
By raising and lowering the mirror, the painted illusion perfectly maps onto the three-dimensional reality.
He proved that a three-dimensional space could be perfectly captured on a two-dimensional plane using strict mathematical laws.
Art was no longer just about divine inspiration. It was geometry.
Which brings us to the second giant who set the stage for Leonardo.
Leon Battista Alberti.
And Alberti shares a crucial demographic detail with Leonardo. He was also an illegitimate son.
Yes. He couldn't inherit his family's banking wealth, so he had to rely on his intellect.
Right. Alberti wrote the definitive treatise on painting, officially elevating the creation of art from a manual craft to a high science.
He codified Brunelleschi's perspective tricks into Euclidean geometry, essentially providing the mathematical source code for visual reality.
So 14-year-old Leonardo steps into this intellectual pressure cooker.
Right.
He's an outsider, armed with practical math and an obsessive eye for nature, walking into a city where art, engineering, and commerce are actively colliding.
And his father, recognizing that the boy is constantly sketching, leverages his connections to secure Leonardo an apprenticeship.
And he doesn't just send him to any painter, he secures a spot at the absolute epicenter of the Florentine tech hub.
The workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio.
Yes. Now, we need to dismantle our modern conception of an artist's studio.
Totally. When we hear the word studio, we imagine a quiet, sunlit loft, classical music playing, a solitary genius agonizing over a canvas.
But Verrocchio's Bottega was the exact opposite.
It was a loud, chaotic commercial factory located on the ground floor, wide open to the street.
It was literally a production line. They were hammering out armor for the Medici guards, casting bronze bells, mass-producing devotional Madonna paintings for local merchants.
Carving marble tombs, designing mechanical gears. It was an environment that demanded collaboration.
And Verrocchio himself was primarily a master sculptor, not a painter,
So
right?
he understood three-dimensional space and the physical mechanics of the human body. He had recently received a commission to create a bronze statue of the biblical hero David.
Okay, and this is where it gets interesting, because the historical texts from the era frequently comment on young Leonardo's striking physical appearance.
Right, describing him as having a beauty of body beyond description.
So it is highly likely, and generally accepted by art historians, that the 14-year-old Leonardo served as the model for Verrocchio's David.
Yes. And when you look at that bronze statue today, it fundamentally alters your perception of the Goliath story.
Because Verrocchio's David isn't a hulking, muscular warrior.
No, it's a slender, slightly effeminate, strikingly pretty teenager wearing a customized leather tunic.
Possessing this tantalizing, half-formed, enigmatic smile.
But if you look past the face and examine the underlying anatomy, this is where Verrocchio was actively teaching his apprentice.
Look at the tight, mathematically perfect grip of David's hand on the sword.
Look at the flex muscle connecting the forearm to the elbow. Look at the luxurious, incredibly complex spirals of curly hair.
Verrocchio was teaching Leonardo how to observe surface anatomy, how models react under tension, and how to capture the kinetic energy of a frozen moment in a static medium.
Exactly. But the apprenticeship wasn't limited to posing for statues or mixing paint.
Right. In 1471, Verrocchio's shop wins the most daunting engineering contract in the city.
They are tasked with constructing a massive 2-ton copper ball called a palla and mounting it onto the very top of the lantern on Brunelleschi's cathedral dome.
This is where the sheer scale of Florentine ambition becomes apparent. You have to hoist thousands of pounds of copper over 300 feet into the air.
Using wooden cranes and rope hoists.
But the true engineering nightmare wasn't lifting the pieces, it was attaching them.
Right. The copper plates had to be soldered together to form a perfect sphere. And in the 1400s, you couldn't haul a modern blowtorch up a cathedral dome.
No, you needed a mobile, intense heat source capable of melting a soldering alloy hundreds of feet in the air.
And the solution they came up with feels like something out of a science fiction novel.
They used fire mirrors.
Yes, fire mirrors. These were massive concave mirrors, some measuring over 3 feet across.
And by precisely calculating the geometry of the curve, they could catch the ambient sunlight and focus it into a single, blindingly hot focal point.
The concentrated solar energy was intense enough to melt the metal alloy and weld the copper plates together.
Which is insane. Imagine being a teenager standing on top of the largest dome in the world, watching your master harness the literal power of the sun to melt metal.
It completely short-circuited Leonardo's brain in the best possible way. He didn't just watch the welding. He became obsessed with the physics making it happen.
He began filling his notebooks with hundreds of diagrams exploring the geometry of light rays.
He wanted to understand exactly how a concave curve forces parallel rays of light to intersect. He experimented with grinding his own lenses and mirrors.
So this single engineering challenge sparked a lifelong obsession with the science of optics.
A science that he would eventually import directly into his paintings.
So he's absorbing heavy engineering, optical physics, and structural anatomy, but he's combining it with an incredibly weird, almost unsettling imagination.
Yes, there was a story from his early days that perfectly encapsulates his bizarre process.
Oh, the dragon shield.
Yes. So a local peasant comes to Ser Piero, Leonardo's father, holding a crude circular wooden shield. He asks Ser Piero to take it to Florence and have an artist paint something intimidating on it.
And Ser Piero hands the cheap shield over to his son.
Now, most apprentices would just paint a generic crest or a stylized lion.
But Leonardo decides he wants to paint a monster, a terrifying, fire-breathing dragon emerging from a dark cave.
But he refuses to just invent a dragon from his imagination. To Leonardo, a convincing fantasy must be rooted in empirical reality.
So he goes out into the countryside and gathers a collection of real, living, and dead animals.
He brings crickets, grasshoppers, bats, lizards, and snakes into his private room.
And he dissects them. He studies the leathery texture of a bat's wing, the segmented armor of a grasshopper, the scales of a lizard.
And then he synthesizes these actual biological parts into a composite nightmare on the wooden shield.
He spends weeks down in his room meticulously painting the way light reflects off the scales, creating shadows that make the monster look violently three-dimensional.
He was in an absolute flow state. The animal carcasses in his room began to decay and putrefy.
Whoa.
The stench was horrific, but Leonardo was so completely consumed by the optical challenge of rendering the dragon's breath and the glossy wetness of its eyes that he didn't even notice the smell.
So when Ser Piero finally knocks on the door to check on the progress, he walks into the dim room, takes one look at the shield, and actually recoils in physical terror.
Because in the low light, the three-dimensional illusion was so perfect, Ser Piero thought a real demon was crawling out of the wood.
But the punchline to the story reveals a lot about the commercial reality of Florence.
Oh, it really does. Ser Piero realizes his son has created a masterpiece. So he secretly sells the rotting animal-inspired shield to some Florentine merchants for a massive profit of 100 ducats.
He then buys a cheap, mass-produced shield with a generic heart painted on it, gives that to the peasant, and pockets the difference.
Unbelievable. That dragon shield eventually made its way into the collection of the Duke of Milan, who bought it for 300 ducats.
So, setting aside Ser Piero's highly questionable business ethics, the dragon shield really illustrates Leonardo's unique algorithm for genius.
He believed that to create a flawless illusion, you first had to master the granular, microscopic reality of the individual components. You can't paint a dragon until you understand the biology of a bat.
Right. And that granular mastery of reality led to the most significant artistic breakthrough of his career, the absolute revolution of how we perceive light and shadow on a canvas.
Which brings us to the science of sight.
In Verrocchio's shop, the apprentices spent countless hours doing drapery studies.
Right, they would take pieces of linen, dip them in wet clay or plaster, arrange them in complex folds, and let them dry.
The goal was to practice capturing the three-dimensional volume of the fabric on a flat piece of paper.
And Leonardo elevated this rudimentary exercise into a master class on chiaroscuro, the interplay of light and dark.
Previously, painters trying to render a shadow on a red cloak would just paint a darker shade of red.
But Leonardo recognized that true shadows are an absence of light. He began darkening his colors by literally mixing black pigment into them, creating deep, cavernous voids in the folds of the cloth.
He was using shadow, not just color, to sculpt volume.
Exactly. But the true paradigm shift, the technique that makes a Leonardo painting instantly recognizable, is the invention of sfumato.
Which is so crucial. To understand sfumato, we have to look back at Leon Battista Alberti, the intellectual who wrote the rulebook for perspective.
Alberti explicitly instructed painters to delineate their figures by drawing crisp, sharp outlines around them.
And Verrocchio, Botticelli, and nearly all the major Florentine artists followed this rule.
They painted beautiful figures, but they often looked like highly polished cutouts pasted onto a background.
But Leonardo, being the disciple of experience, rejected the accepted authority. He observed the real world.
If you look at an object right now, look at a coffee cup on your desk, or a tree outside the window, there is no thick black line outlining the edge, because our eyes are spheres. The focal point of human vision is incredibly narrow. When you focus intensely on the center of an object, the edges naturally blur into the surrounding atmosphere.
So Leonardo realized that painting a sharp outline was a scientific lie. So he developed sfumato.
A word derived from the Italian for smoke.
He began deliberately blurring the contours and edges of his subjects. He dissolved the hard lines so that the jawline of a face gently vanishes into the shadow of the neck, like smoke dissipating in the air.
And sfumato isn't just an aesthetic choice, it's a psychological trick. By leaving the edges slightly out of focus, he forces the viewer's brain to complete the image.
It introduces ambiguity.
Exactly. A sharply outlined face is static, frozen. A face rendered in sfumato seems to breathe, to pulse, because your eyes can't quite lock onto the absolute boundary of the form. It makes the painting look violently alive.
The evolution of this technique is captured perfectly in 3 specific case studies from his early career.
Right, starting with a collaborative painting from the workshop, Tobias and the Angel.
Verrocchio's shop was in direct competition with 2 brothers, the Palaiolos, who had painted a highly regarded but incredibly stiff version of this biblical scene.
Verrocchio wanted to outdo them, so he designed a much more dynamic composition. But he delegated 2 specific, minor details to his young apprentice.
He told Leonardo to paint the fish that Tobias is carrying and the little dog trotting along at their feet.
And the contrast is staggering. If you look at the dog the Palaiolo brothers painted, it looks like bad taxidermy. It's stiff, flat, and completely lifeless.
Then you look at the corner of Verrocchio's canvas. Leonardo paints a small, prancing dog that is practically vibrating with alertness.
The muscles in its legs are tense, and its coat is rendered with these meticulously observed, tight, spiraling curls of hair that echo the physics of swirling water.
But the fish is where he really flexes his scientific observation. Tobias is holding a dead fish by a string.
And Leonardo paints the scales not just as silver pigment, but with tiny, microscopic spots of luster. He captures the exact white glint of sunlight, hitting a wet, slimy surface.
He even adds a terrifying touch of realism. A single drop of blood realistically seeping from the fish's cut belly.
It was a clear signal. Even as a teenager, his ability to synthesize light, moisture, and anatomy was fundamentally operating on a different level than the established masters of Florence.
Which brings us to case study 2, arguably the most famous passing of the torch moment in art history, the baptism of Christ.
Verrocchio was commissioned to paint this large altarpiece. He executed the central figures, John the Baptist and Jesus, using tempera paint.
Tempera is made by binding color pigments with egg yolk, right?
Yes. It is a fantastic, durable medium, but it dries almost instantly. Because it dries so fast, you can't smoothly blend colors on the canvas.
You have to build up shadows using thousands of tiny, distinct, cross-hatched brushstrokes.
The result is that Verrocchio's figures, particularly the angel he painted on the right, look a bit wooden. The transitions from light to shadow are harsh.
So Verrocchio then asks Leonardo to paint the accompanying angel kneeling on the far left,
And Leonardo decides to completely abandon tempera. He uses the relatively new medium of oil paint.
which dries incredibly slowly, sometimes taking days or weeks to fully set.
This fundamentally changes the physics of painting. Because it stays wet, Leonardo could apply incredibly thin, translucent layers of color called glazes, one over the other.
He paints his angel twisting naturally, looking back over its shoulder. The face possesses a supernatural grace.
But the magic is in the shadows. Because the oil was wet, Leonardo literally abandoned his brush. He used his bare fingertips to physically massage the dark pigment into the light pigment.
Which is amazing. Modern X-ray and infrared analysis confirm this, right?
They do. You can see Leonardo's actual fingerprints embedded in the microscopic layers of paint, smoothing the transition under the angel's chin into a flawless, smoky sfumato.
But he didn't stop at the angel. Leonardo looked at the static, boring rocks Verrocchio had painted in the background, and he painted over them.
He replaced the rocks with a misty atmospheric landscape. He painted a river flowing down from a distant glacier, cutting through the valley.
Creating perfectly rendered fluid dynamic eddies swirling around the angles of Christ.
He visually connected the macrocosm of the geological earth with the microcosm of human anatomy.
And the 16th century biographer Giorgio Vasari started a legend that when Verrocchio saw the luminous perfection of Leonardo's angel, he felt so profoundly eclipsed that he laid down his brushes and swore never to touch paint again.
While that is likely a dramatic embellishment, the historical reality actually aligns with it. After the baptism of Christ, Verrocchio virtually abandoned painting and focused entirely on his bronze and marble sculptures.
The apprentice had rendered the master obsolete.
Truly. So Leonardo strikes out on his own.
Case Study 3 is an early solo work, The Annunciation. He's in his early 20s, no longer under Verrocchio's supervision.
You walk up to this painting expecting the flawless perfection of the angel from the baptism, and honestly, it looks like the genius completely botched it.
It is deeply jarring to a modern viewer looking at it straight on in a museum. The Virgin Mary is sitting at a lectern, and her anatomy is profoundly wrong.
The drapery covering her legs makes it look like she has 3 knees.
Furthermore, her right arm, the one reaching out across the table, is bizarrely elongated. It looks stretched and dislocated.
Even the majestic cypress trees in the background seem weirdly flat and squashed.
So, was he just having an off day? Did he rush it?
Not at all. The mistakes are entirely deliberate, but you have to understand the physical context of where the painting was meant to live.
Because Leonardo wasn't painting a canvas to be hung at eye level in a brightly lit gallery.
Right, the Annunciation was commissioned for a specific church, to be hung high up on a specific wall. The congregation wouldn't view it straight on. They would approach it from an angle, walking down the aisle from the right side, looking up.
Ah, so he was playing with perspective.
He was experimenting with a highly complex geometric principle called anamorphosis. He mathematically stretched and distorted the image on the flat panel.
If you take a replica of the painting today, stand to the far right side, and crouch down slightly, the optical illusion snaps into place.
The distorted, elongated arm suddenly recedes and looks perfectly proportioned. The weird knees align. The flattened trees suddenly gain 3-dimensional depth.
It's an Easter egg. He deliberately broke the 2-dimensional rules of the canvas so that the image would perfectly reconstruct itself in the 3-dimensional space of the viewer's eyeball.
It might have been too clever for its own good, as it looks terrible from any other angle, but it proves that his mind was constantly fusing the rigid science of optics with visual art.
But where does he get this obsession with optical illusions and manipulating an audience's physical perspective?
The answer brings us directly back to the economic engine of Florence. Leonardo wasn't just sitting in a studio painting altarpieces. He was deeply embedded in the Florentine entertainment industry.
Right. We are entering the realm of pageants, plays, and the theatrical mind.
In 1471, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, the brutal and incredibly wealthy Duke of Milan, decides to visit Florence.
And the Medici family goes into overdrive to impress him. This wasn't just a dinner party. The Duke arrives with an entourage of 2,000 people, thousands of horses, packs of hunting dogs, and an army of personal servants.
Florence essentially transforms the entire city into a stage set. The Medici commission spectacular pageants, jousts, and theatrical performances in the piazzas.
Verrocchio's commercial shop is hired to design the aesthetics of the spectacle. They are building sets, hammering out ornate, fantastical armor, and designing parade floats.
And Leonardo thrived in this chaotic environment. He threw himself into theatrical engineering.
He loved devising complex costumes and designing elaborate, moving stage machinery, which were known at the time as ingenia.
He was building massive gears, pulleys, and winches hidden behind painted backdrops to create real-time special effects.
Okay, I have to stop you here because this theatrical context perfectly answers one of the most pervasive myths about Leonardo da Vinci.
Oh, the helicopter.
Yes. From the time we are kids, we are taught that Leonardo invented the helicopter hundreds of years before the Wright brothers even understood lift.
Right. The famous sketch of the aerial screw, the wooden platform, with a massive spiral canvas sail on top.
Is that an actual prototype for human flight?
This is where context fundamentally rewrites history. Isaacson points out that if you look at the physics of the aerial screw, it is an aeronautical failure.
Why?
The mechanism requires 4 men running in a circle to crank the central shaft. 4 human beings simply cannot generate enough rotational velocity to lift a heavy wooden platform off the ground.
And Leonardo, who studied the physics of weight and gravity obsessively, absolutely knew this.
Exactly.
So if it wasn't meant to fly, what was it?
The prevailing theory, supported by his work in Florence and later in Milan, is that the aerial screw, along with many of his mechanical, hand-cranked flapping wing contraptions, were theatrical props.
Wow.
During these religious pageants, they needed a way to lower actors playing angels from the rafters of a church down to the stage, simulating flight.
So the spinning sail wasn't meant to generate lift. It was meant to safely slow a descent, or just to look incredibly cool as an actor was lowered on a hidden rope.
Exactly. It was a stage trick. It was an amusement designed to wow a crowd during a spectacle, not a functioning prototype meant to carry a human into the clouds.
That makes infinitely more sense than assuming the greatest observer of physics in history somehow forgot the basic laws of power-to-weight ratios.
Exactly.
But more importantly, working in theater trained his brain in a specific way. It taught him how to manipulate an audience.
Theater is the ultimate exercise in forced perspective. When you build a set, you have 3-dimensional wooden columns in the foreground that seamlessly transition into a flat painted backdrop.
You learn how to use lighting, shadow, and foreshortening to trick the audience's brain into ignoring the boundary between physical reality and two-dimensional illusion.
Leonardo took all those theatrical tricks, the dramatic lighting, the blurred boundaries, the command of the viewer's eye, and directly imported them into his canvases.
So, picture the man at this stage in his life. He is a master of illusion, a bastard son who sidestepped a traditional education, spending his days dissecting rotting animals and designing theatrical hoists.
His outsider status allowed him to completely ignore the boundaries of traditional disciplines, and that outsider status deeply defined his highly unconventional personal life.
He was a misfit in almost every conceivable way a person could be in 15th century Italy.
He was left-handed, which was often viewed with suspicion. To avoid smudging the wet ink as his hand moved across the page, he wrote entirely in mirror script.
Writing from right to left, requiring you to hold the paper up to a mirror to read it easily.
He was a vegetarian, frequently buying caged birds in the market just to set them free. And crucially, he was unapologetically gay in a society that officially and violently criminalized it.
In 1476, when Leonardo was 24 years old, his personal life violently collides with the legal system in an event known as the Saltarelli Affair.
Florence had a severe approach to public morality. The city placed wooden boxes around town called tamburi,
Which were essentially anonymous tip boxes where citizens could drop notes accusing their neighbors of vice crimes.
Right. A note was dropped into a tamburo, anonymously accusing Leonardo and 3 other young men of committing sodomy with a 17-year-old male prostitute named Jacopo Saltarelli.
And sodomy was not a minor infraction. The city had a dedicated police force called the Officers of the Night, specifically tasked with rooting it out.
The penalties were brutal. You could be publicly humiliated, heavily fined, exiled from the city, or, in extreme cases, burned at the stake.
Leonardo was officially investigated by the Officers of the Night. It's highly probable he was briefly jailed during the initial inquiry.
The terror of that experience profoundly rattled him. Ultimately, the charges were formally dismissed.
Because the laws required a corroborating witness to back up an anonymous accusation, and no one came forward.
It also didn't hurt that one of the other young men accused alongside him had close familial ties to the powerful Medici family, who likely applied pressure to squash the scandal.
But the brush with a total ruin left a scar. Shortly after the investigation, you can find a fragmented, haunting sentence scribbled in the margins of his notebook.
He writes, "If there is no love, what then?"
It's a moment of profound vulnerability, Yet, despite the very real threat of execution or exile, Leonardo refused to hide his sexuality.
He lived openly and elegantly. He frequently surrounded himself with strikingly beautiful young male companions,
There was Adelante Migliorati, a talented young musician, and later in life he adopted a young boy into his household who grew up to be his longtime companion.
whom Leonardo nicknamed Salai, which translates to the little devil.
His orientation is also vividly mapped out in his anatomical studies. He wrote openly in his notes that he found the mechanics of heterosexual copulation physically repulsive.
When you examine his sketches of the human body, the disparity is obvious. He draws male nudes with incredible tender care, obsessing over the exact curvature of the muscles and the grace of the form.
His drawings of female anatomy are far less frequent and often structurally awkward or clinical.
But here is the magnificent paradox of his life. Even though his romantic and physical attractions were exclusively directed toward men, he fundamentally revolutionized how women were portrayed in the history of art.
This makes sense on a psychological level. When you exist on the margins of society, when you are illegitimate, when your very existence is criminalized by the state, you develop a heightened sense of empathy.
You learn to acutely observe the hidden internal lives of the people around you because you spend your entire life guarding your own internal truth.
That profound empathy, that ability to capture the hidden architecture of a human soul, crystallizes in his portrait of a young woman named Ginevra da Vinci.
Looking at Ginevra da Vinci, especially if you understand the context of the era, is a shock to the system.
Traditionally, if a wealthy Florentine merchant wanted a portrait of his daughter or wife, he commissioned a flat, strict side profile.
They look like the faces stamped on coins. The women are usually staring blankly ahead, loaded down with heavy jewelry and expensive brocade fabrics.
They weren't meant to capture a personality, they were status symbols meant to advertise the family's wealth to potential suitors.
But Leonardo completely shatters that convention. He strips away all the ostentatious jewelry. He dresses her in a simple, elegant bodice.
But the radical innovation is her posture. He rotates her body into a three-quarter pose. She is physically turned toward the viewer.
Because he believed that the eyes are the window of the soul. He couldn't paint her soul from a flat side profile.
We are looking directly into her face, and her expression is mesmerizing. She looks pale, guarded, and deeply melancholy.
The details are staggering. He places a dark juniper bush right behind her head, a visual pun on her name, Gina Pro, but also a framing device that pushes her pale face out into the three-dimensional space of the room.
And the eyes, you mentioned the luster on the fish scales earlier. He uses that exact same technique on her eyes.
There is a tiny, perfectly placed pinprick of white light reflecting off her pupils.
That single drop of white paint catches the ambient light of the room, making her gaze feel wet and incredibly alive.
It creates the optical illusion that her eyes are tracking you as you move around the painting.
If you visit the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and look closely at the shadows around her jawline and her cheekbones, you can see the sfumato technique in its absolute prime.
He didn't use a brush to blend the shadows. He used his fingers. You can see the actual whorls of his fingerprints pressed into the oil paint, literally physically massaging her melancholy expression into existence.
By stripping away the jewelry and focusing entirely on the complex, guarded, internal mood of the subject, Leonardo creates the first true psychological portrait in history.
Ginevra isn't a status symbol. She is a human being with secrets. This painting is the direct, unmistakable ancestor to the Mona Lisa.
Every single thread we've discussed today, his obsessive anatomical study of muscles, his deep understanding of optical physics, his command of theatrical staging, and his profound psychological empathy. All of these disciplines finally converge in the year 1481.
They culminate in a massive project that famously he walked away from and completely abandoned.
We are diving into the beauty of the unfinished, the adoration of the Magi.
The monks of San Donato commissioned him to paint the Epiphany the moment the three wise men visit the infant Jesus.
Now, by 1481, Leonardo's reputation as a genius is established, but so is his reputation for severe distraction and failing to hit deadlines.
The monks are terrified he won't finish it, so they draft a bizarre, hyper-punitive, legal contract. They refuse to pay for his paints up front.
They stipulate he must finish the massive panel in exactly 30 months, or they keep the painting and pay him nothing.
And just to add insult to injury, his final payment isn't just cash. He is required to pay for a local girl's dowry out of his own fee.
He was incredibly strapped for cash. Isaacson notes he was so broke during this period that he took a side job painting the face of a clock for the monks just to get a load of firewood to heat his house.
But despite the financial pressure, his conceptual vision for the adoration was completely uncompromising.
Look at how previous artists handled the adoration. Botticelli painted it a few years earlier.
Botticelli's version is a stately, polite, highly organized procession. Everyone is wearing gorgeous clothes, standing in neat rows, looking very serene.
Leonardo completely rejects that premise. He reasons that if the literal creator of the universe suddenly manifested in human form on Earth, the reaction wouldn't be polite, it would be a shockwave.
He designs a chaotic, frenzied vortex of motion. The infant Jesus is in the center, and swirling around him is a hurricane of human emotion.
Over 60 individual figures, horses rearing up in terror, old men collapsing in awe, soldiers looking on in confusion, people shielding their eyes from the divine light.
The panel we have today is essentially an underdrawing. It's just the sketch mapped out on the wood in dark brown ink and wash before the layers of color were applied.
But because it's unfinished, it is the greatest window we have into his methodology. It is a masterpiece of applied mathematics and biology.
To create the background, which features the ruins of an ancient temple, he drove a physical nail into the center of the wooden panel.
He attached a piece of string to the nail, pulled it taut, and used it as a straight edge to perfectly map out the geometric grid of linear perspective. The architecture recedes into the distance with flawless mathematical precision.
Once the geometric stage was set, he began populating the vortex. Following the theories laid out by Alberti, Leonardo didn't just draw people wearing robes.
He built every single human figure from the inside out. He sketched the skeletons first to ensure the joints were aligned.
Then he added the muscular structure over the bones, specifically focusing on how muscles tense when a body recoils in shock or leans forward in awe.
Only after the biological engine was perfect did he roughly sketch the clothing over them.
He manually engineered a mathematical grid, built 60 individual biological machines inside it, and choreographed them into a vortex of explosive psychological emotion.
He achieves the most dynamic, scientifically perfect composition of the Renaissance. And then he just stops. He packs up his things and abandons the painting.
Why? How do you put that much obsessive work into a masterpiece and just walk away?
Well, it was the curse of his own expanding knowledge. He simply knew too much about the physical mechanics of the world.
Think about the specific optical problem he created for himself. He has a vortex of 60 overlapping figures. He knows that light isn't just a white beam. It reflects the color of the object it hits.
Wait, so if I'm understanding this, he's basically trying to manually calculate a physics simulation in his head?
Yes.
If a guy wearing a blue tunic is standing shoulder to shoulder with a guy in a yellow tunic, Leonardo isn't just painting blue and yellow.
Exactly. He is trying to calculate the mathematical geometry of the light, hitting the blue fabric, bouncing off, and slightly tinting the shadows on the yellow fabric next to it.
And that tinted yellow light will then reflect onto the skin tone of the person behind them.
Modern computers use massive GPU power to perform ray tracing, to simulate this kind of ambient light bounce in video games.
Leonardo was trying to manually calculate ray tracing for 60 moving human bodies on a wooden panel using oil paint.
He essentially over-engineered the composition until it broke the processing limits of a 15th century medium.
The physical execution became mathematically impossible to perfect, but there is a deeper psychological reason he walked away.
His mind moved infinitely faster than his brush. Leonardo's ultimate joy was in the conceptualization, the solving of the puzzle.
Once he had mapped the geometric grid, built the skeletons, and solved the intellectual challenge of the emotional vortex, the actual tedious physical act of applying layers of paint bored him.
Isaacson uses a brilliant quote in the book. Vision without execution is hallucination. Usually that's a criticism.
But for Leonardo, his internal visions were so deeply grounded in science, so structurally sublime, that bringing them into the physical world was almost always a disappointment.
He could see the microscopic flaws in the light bounce that no patron would ever notice. The hallucination was perfect. The painting could never be.
We look at the Adoration of the Magi and weep because it's unfinished. Leonardo looked at it, realized he had solved the physics problem he set out to solve, and simply opened a new browser tab.
His curiosity moved on.
What a profound way to understand his mind. We've traced the path from an illegitimate kid standing at the terrifying edge of a dark cave to an apprentice fusing the heavy engineering of cathedral domes with the delicate biology of bat wings.
To a master who fundamentally altered the physics of how humanity is rendered on canvas.
His lack of formal traditional schooling wasn't a deficit, it was his ultimate weapon. It freed him to tear down the artificial walls we build between mathematics, anatomy, theater, and art.
If there is a final actionable thought to take away from reverse engineering a mind like Leonardo's, it circles right back to where we started.
Think about that to-do list. Think about the woodpecker's tongue.
Describe the tongue of the woodpecker.
He didn't want to know how it worked so he could optimize his workflow or secure a grant or beat a rival artist.
He investigated the anatomy of a bird simply because he believed that the intricate mechanics of the universe were intrinsically worthy of our attention.
He allowed himself to marvel at the world without demanding that the knowledge be immediately useful.
So tomorrow, when you walk out of your house, try to borrow his eyes for just a few minutes.
Notice how the sunlight wraps around the shadow of your coffee cup. Look at how the rainwater forms complex, swirling eddies as it hits a grate in the street.
Embrace the sumato blur, the hard edges between the different disciplines and routines in your own life.
Because genius isn't a clean, categorical superpower. It is messy, it is cross-disciplinary, it is wildly easily distracted, and above all, it never ever stops being wonderfully curious. And that's all for today's deep dive.